Why do intelligent people repeat the exact decisions that ruin their parents? We see this pattern everywhere. A child grows up watching a parent destroy their life through obsession, debt, or isolation. The child promises themselves they will never make those mistakes. Yet 30 years later, they find themselves in the exact same position, executing the exact same self-destructive behaviors. Psychologists call this repetition compulsion, the subconscious drive to recreate historical trauma in a futile attempt to rewrite the ending. But the ending rarely changes. Most families do not operate on free will. They operate on a hidden loop, running a pre-programmed script written generations before they were even born. Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude is famous for its magical realism. But strip away the folklore, and it is a cold, clinical case study of how a family and a society destroys itself by trapping its members in a closed psychological loop. The story begins with an escape. The visionary founder of the Buendía clan commits a murder in his original settlement. Driven by guilt and the constant presence of his victim's memory, he takes his wife, the matriarch, and a small band of followers into the wilderness. They trek through swamps and over mountains for months, seeking a place where the past cannot reach them. They stop beside a clear, stony river and build a settlement. They call it Macondo. Initially, the town is designed as a physical utopia. The houses are built of mud and cane, positioned so that every household has equal access to the water and the sun. There is no government, no church, and no law. The visionary founder spends his days designing the town's layout, plotting its future, while the matriarch manages the practical survival of the household. She plants the crops, tends the animals, and ensures the family is fed. They are completely isolated, surrounded by an impassable swamp on one side and a vast mountain range on the other. In the language of systems theory, Macondo is a closed loop. It has no external inputs and no outputs. Initially, this isolation feels like peace. There is no crime because there is nothing to steal and no one to envy. But human psychology does not tolerate a vacuum. Without external feedback, the human mind loses its ability to calibrate reality. If you never interact with anyone who disagrees with you, your wildest ideas begin to look like absolute truths. The visionary founder is highly intelligent, but his intelligence has no practical outlet. He has no books, no scientific peers, and no contact with modern progress. His curiosity, left to rot in the damp jungle air, turns inward. He begins to obsess over concepts he does not understand, trying to solve problems that the outside world resolved centuries ago. Without a reality check, the line between genius and delusion disappears. The matriarch watches him, working quietly in the background, keeping the house clean while her husband slowly detaches from the physical world. The seeds of the family's ruin are not planted by an external enemy. They are bred right here, in the quiet, undisturbed soil of their own isolation. The barrier eventually breaks. A group of traveling merchants makes its way through the swamps. They bring simple instruments from the outside world, magnets, magnifying glasses, and astrolabes. To the isolated villagers, these are not tools of science, they are miracles. The merchants present a pair of heavy metal magnets. The visionary founder watches as iron pots drag themselves across the dirt floors and rusted nails tear themselves out of the wooden walls. He does not see a simple physical demonstration. He sees a tool of conquest. He immediately decides he can use these metal blocks to extract gold from the earth. He trades his family's domestic animals their actual survival security for the magnets. The matriarch protests, pointing to the empty pens, but the founder does not listen. He spends months dragging the magnets across the damp soil, finding nothing but old armor and rusted nails. On their next visit, the merchants bring a giant magnifying glass. The founder watches the sun's light focus into a single burning point. He tests it on a dry leaf, then on his own hand, watching his skin blister. Again, his mind skips past utility straight to warfare. He imagines a concentration of mirrors that can incinerate an invading army from miles away. He trades his remaining gold coins, the family's entire inheritance, for the glass. He spends months in his small laboratory, blinded by the sun, trying to weaponize light, completely abandoned to his obsession. The closed system of Macondo has received its first external shock, and the loop has begun to spin. The merchants return every spring, bringing new tools, a telescope, an astrolabe, and, eventually, a chest containing a block of solid ice transported through the swamps in wet straw. To the villagers, the ice is an impossibility. It burns the skin when touched, but while the others touch it and laugh, the visionary founder sees something else. He pays 5 gold coins just to let his sons touch it, then sits and watches it melt. The water drops fall into the dry dust of the floor, disappearing instantly, but he stares at the damp spot for hours. He does not think of refrigeration. He does not think of preserving the town's food supply or making life in the tropical heat more bearable. Instead, he draws up blueprints. He writes to the government in a distant city, proposing a system of mirrors to focus the sun's rays and melt the polar caps. He uses the magnets to drag for gold in the riverbeds, retrieving only rusted nails and discarded iron hinges. He uses the magnifying glasses to construct a weapon, spending weeks trying to burn a hole through a wooden plank from 50 paces away. He neglects the crops. The town's administration falls entirely on his neighbors, while his own household runs on credit. He moves his workspace into a small, windowless room at the back of the house. He locks the door from the inside. The matriarch ceases to ask him for help. The children grow up without his instruction. When his sons enter the room, they find him surrounded by brass instruments, yellowed maps, and small vials of quicksilver. He does not look up when they speak. His skin turns pale, then yellow, from the fumes of the chemicals he burns. The town of Macondo is growing. Other settlers arrive, building roads, establishing trade routes, and setting up businesses. A formal magistrate is sent by the government to establish order. The founder does not attend the town meetings. He does not recognize the new arrivals. His world has shrunk to the width of his workbench. This is the classic failure of abstract intelligence. In modern terms, the founder is the entrepreneur who isolates himself in a garage for a decade to build a machine no one asked for, solving problems that do not exist. Intelligence is not self-correcting. Without a loop of practical application, without testing ideas against the hard surface of reality, the mind simply builds more complex delusions. The founder's calculations are technically precise. His maps are beautiful. His geometric proofs are flawless. But they produce nothing. They do not feed his family. They do not build a single wall in Macondo. The matriarch works in the physical world of mud, wood, and bread. She understands that a house requires maintenance, that children require food, and that a community requires rules. The founder operates in a world of pure theory, where the laws of thermodynamics do not apply. But when a system is completely disconnected from its environment, it eventually breaks down. The founder's mind, left with only its own thoughts to consume, begins to feed on itself. The break happens without warning. He emerges from his laboratory one morning, looking at the familiar objects in his courtyard as if they are foreign artifacts. He looks at his wife and does not recognize her face. He believes the calendar has stopped. He insists that every day is Tuesday, that the air is heavy, and that the world is repeating the same 24 hours over and over. When his family tries to lead him back to his bed, he becomes violent. He breaks his scientific instruments, smashes his brass astrolabe against the stone floor, and tears his maps to shreds with his fingernails. It takes 10 men from the village to restrain him. They carry him out to the courtyard, to a massive chestnut tree that stands near the center of the property. They wrap thick hemp ropes around his torso and bind him to the trunk. He does not struggle against the ropes for long. He settles into the dirt at the base of the tree. He spends his days there, exposed to the rain and the midday heat. He stops speaking the language of his family. Instead, he babbles continuously in a strange, structured tongue that no one in Macondo understands, a dead language of ancient law and old churches. The matriarch builds a small palm thatch roof over his head to keep off the sun. She brings him bowls of soup, feeding him with a wooden spoon, as if he were an infant. From the kitchen window, his children and grandchildren watch the man who founded their town. He sits in the mud, talking to ghosts, completely bound by the ropes, while the town he built moves on without him. The second generation of the Buendía clan does not stay in the courtyard. The warmonger's son looks at the isolation of Macondo and chooses the opposite path: expansion and conflict. When a civil war breaks out between the conservative government and the liberal rebels, he does not hesitate. He recruits a small army of local youth, arms them with hunting rifles, and marches out of the jungle. He leaves behind his family and the quiet routine of the town, trading them for the chaos of the national stage. His military career is a ledger of absolute defeat. He organizes 32 distinct armed uprisings against the government. He loses every single one of them. He marches thousands of miles, commands vast armies, and dictates peace treaties, yet his strategic objectives are never met. Despite the constant failure, he proves impossible to kill. He survives a firing squad when the executioners deliberately aim away from his chest. He survives an assassination attempt by a soldier who sneaks into his tent at night. He survives a massive dose of strychnine slipped into his coffee, vomiting the poison onto the dirt floor and returning to duty the next morning. He becomes a myth not because he wins, but because he refuses to stop losing. But the constant violence hollows him out. In the early years, he fought for specific political goals: land reform, civil rights, the separation of church and state. But after decades of marching through swamps and ordering executions, the ideology dissolves. When a young officer asks him what the actual difference is between their platform and the government's, the warmonger's son stares at him. "The difference," the warmonger's son says, "is that we are going to shoot you." He signs the execution order that evening. War ceases to be a means to an end. It becomes the end itself. He orders the execution of his closest friends because they question his tactics. He demands a 10-foot circle of chalk be drawn around him wherever he goes, forbidding anyone, even his mother, the matriarch, from stepping inside his personal space. He is no longer a man fighting for a cause. He is a bureaucrat of violence, executing military maneuvers because the routine of the battlefield is the only thing that keeps his mind from collapsing into the same silence that claimed his father under the chestnut tree. When the war finally ends with a signed peace treaty, he refuses the pension offered by the government. He walks back into Macondo, returns to his family's house, and locks himself in a small workshop. He takes up a highly specific, repetitive task. He melts down gold coins and fashions them into tiny, delicate gold fishes with red gems for eyes. The work requires intense focus. The gold must be heated to the exact melting point, poured into tiny molds, and filed with microscopic precision. His eyes grow weak from the fumes of the crucible, forcing him to wear thick spectacles just to see the metal. He works with absolute precision, spending days on a single fish, but he does not sell them. Once he accumulates 25 gold fishes, he melts them back down in his crucible, turning them back into raw gold ingots. Then, he begins the process again. This is the trap of pointless action. We often mistake movement for progress. In modern environments, we see this in the executive who works 80 hours a week on projects that do not matter, or the creator who continuously edits a draft they will never publish. It is a form of active avoidance. By keeping his hands constantly moving, by focusing on the microscopic detail of a gold scale, the warmonger's son does not have to think about the thousands of men he sent to their deaths. He does not have to think about his failed revolution. The busy work is a shield against self-reflection. He melts the fishes down because finishing the project would force him to confront the silence of the room. He creates his own closed loop, inside the larger loop of his family. He maintains this routine for years, refusing to speak to the townspeople, ignoring the political changes happening outside his door. One afternoon, the workshop is unusually quiet. The matriarch enters the room to bring him his meal. The warmonger's son is leaning against his workbench, his head resting against the rough wooden surface. His tools are laid out neatly beside him. In his cold hand he grips a half-finished goldfish, its metal scales catching the faint light from the window. While the men of the Buendía clan lose themselves in warfare and laboratory calculations, the physical survival of the household remains the sole responsibility of one person, the matriarch. She does not have the luxury of obsession. When the roof rots, she hires the laborers to replace it. When the family finances collapse due to her husband's failed experiments, she starts a bakery business from her kitchen, selling candy animals to the townspeople. She uses the profits to expand the house, building new rooms to accommodate the growing family. She raises her own children, then her grandchildren, and eventually her great-grandchildren. She outlives her husband, her sons, and several of her daughters-in-law. Her body shrinks with age, her spine curves, but she remains the central axis around which the entire household turns. She lives to be well over 100 years old, working 18 hours a day, her hands constantly white with flour or gray with wash water. In modern organizational terms, the matriarch is the ultimate hyper-competent manager operating within a highly toxic enterprise. She keeps the lights on, meets the payroll, and cleans up the wreckage left behind by erratic leadership. But this competence carries a hidden cost. By constantly stepping in to fix every disaster, she shields the family from the natural consequences of their behavior. When her husband destroys their savings, she generates more. When her sons abandon their domestic duties to pursue wars and useless inventions, she ensures their children do not starve. She acts as an emotional buffer, absorbing the shock waves of their self-destruction. In doing so, she inadvertently enables the loop. Because the men never have to face the cold reality of their failures, they are free to remain children. They never adapt, they never mature, and they never learn to manage the practical world. Her strength is the very thing that permits their weakness to flourish. As she enters her final years, her eyesight begins to fail. She does not tell her family. Instead, she memorizes the distances between the furniture, counting her steps to maintain the illusion of sight. She identifies family members not by their faces, but by the sound of their footsteps, the rhythm of their breathing, and the scent of the materials they carry on their clothes. This physical blindness sharpens her psychological sight. She begins to notice something she had missed while she was busy managing the household. She observes the children of the fourth and fifth generations. She listens to their voices and watches their habits. She hears the exact same voice inflections, the same rigid stubbornness, and the same quiet, detached arrogance that characterized her husband and her firstborn sons. She walks past a bedroom and hears a young boy planning an escape, using the exact phrasing his great-uncle used 80 years before. She hears another child cataloging old papers in the laboratory, replicating the precise shuffling walk of her deceased husband. The names repeat, the temperaments repeat, and the tragedies repeat. One child isolates himself with the goldfishes, another seeks power through conflict, another retreats into quiet study. They are not distinct individuals. They are copies of a single design, executing the same program. She whispers her observation to herself in the dark corridors of the house. Time is not passing, it is turning in a circle. In a closed system, time does not function as a straight line. It has no forward trajectory. Because the system refuses to learn from its past, it cannot create a new future. It simply loops. The characters believe they are making independent choices, exploring new ideas, and building a new world. In reality, they are just riding a carousel. They use different tools and fight in different wars, but they end up in the exact same place, isolated, detached, and empty. For 50 years she believed she was building a dynasty. Now, she understands she has merely been maintaining a cage. When she finally dies, her body is so small and dry that she fits into a coffin no larger than a child's toy box. With her death, the central anchor of the Buendía clan is gone. There is no longer anyone to balance the books, patch the roof, or enforce reality. The family members drift further into their individual rooms, locking their doors, retreating into their private obsessions. The weeds begin to crack the cement of the courtyard, and dust settles on the brass instruments in the laboratory. The town of Macondo, once a quiet, isolated settlement in the jungle, has lost its shield. It lies exposed, wealthy but fragile, ready for the arrival of a true apex predator that has been watching from across the sea. The isolation of Macondo ends with a whistle. A railroad line cuts through the swamp, connecting the town directly to the coast. Along with the train comes the foreign corporation. They do not arrive as travelers or merchants, but as surveyors, engineers, and armed guards. They fence off thousands of acres of fertile land around the town, clearing the native trees to plant endless, uniform rows of banana plants. They build a separate, enclosed district for themselves, complete with manicured lawns, air-conditioned houses, and high-wire fences designed to keep the local population out. While the locals walk on unpaved dirt streets, the foreigners live behind armed checkpoints. They bring electricity, money, and thousands of migrant workers seeking quick wealth in the fields. The Buendía clan and the citizens of Macondo are completely unprepared for this development. They had spent decades arguing over local politics, family pride, and abstract science. But they have no defense against the systematic, industrial-scale exploitation of resources. The economic boom is real, but it is an illusion of prosperity. The locals earn cash, but they spend it in shops owned by the corporation, buying imported goods brought in on corporate trains. The local economy is hollowed out. The residents do not own the land, they do not own the railroad, and they do not own the power lines. They have been converted from independent founders into low-wage agricultural laborers. When the global market price of the fruit fluctuates, the corporation adjusts the wages, and the townspeople have no leverage. They are cogs in a machine designed elsewhere. The great family house, once the center of power and decision-making in Macondo, is bypassed, ignored by the new engineers. The friction begins when the plantation workers organize. They demand simple, practical concessions, sanitary bathrooms, medical care, and pay in actual currency rather than corporate vouchers that can only be spent in company stores. The foreign corporation refuses to negotiate. They petition the national government, claiming the strike is an armed rebellion organized by foreign agitators. The government responds by sending the military. The soldiers gather 3,000 workers and their families in the central square of Macondo under the pretext of facilitating an official announcement from the governor. The exits to the square are quietly blocked with heavy machine gun nests. When the crowd refuses to disperse, the commanding officer gives the order. The gunfire lasts for several minutes. The enclosed space offers no cover. The bodies fall in heaps onto the dust of the plaza, men, women, and children alike, systematically eliminated in the name of corporate order. One member of the Buendía clan, a quiet young man who had joined the strike, survives the shooting by hiding under the piled bodies of his comrades. He loses consciousness. He wakes up hours later on a long cargo train moving through the night. He is surrounded by corpses. He climbs to the edge of the flatbed and leaps into the dark brush beside the tracks. He walks back to Macondo on foot, hiding in the swamps, expecting to find a town in mourning. Instead, he finds the streets quiet. The market stalls are open. People are buying food and talking about the weather. The rain has washed the blood from the stone plaza. The military has occupied the town, but there are no bodies, no funerals, and no grieving families. He asks a fruit seller where the workers went. The seller shrugs. "There are no workers here," he says. "They left." During the night, the military had loaded all 3,000 dead onto cargo trains, transported them to the coast, and dumped them into the sea to be consumed by the water. The survivor goes to his neighbors, to his family, and to the shopkeepers. He tells them about the machine guns and the mounds of dead in the plaza. They look at him with blank faces. They tell him he must have had a bad dream. The government has issued an official decree, published in the newspapers and broadcasted by the authorities. There was no strike, no military presence, and no massacre. The workers simply agreed to terms and returned to their villages. True power is not the ability to kill. It is the ability to dictate reality. When the state and the employer control the information flow, the physical event is irrelevant. If there is no record, no body, and no public grief, the crime did not happen. The survivors are forced to doubt their own senses. adjusting their memories to match the official narrative to preserve their sanity. Unable to convince a single person of the truth, the survivor stops speaking. He retreats to the family house, enters the quiet room once occupied by his ancestors, and locks the door. He sits at the dusty wooden table, opens a stack of old, unread manuscripts, and completely detaches himself from the world outside. The foreign corporation departs as quickly as it arrived. Once the local land is depleted and the labor force is broken, the investors pull their capital, dismantle the machinery, and leave the fields to the jungle. Then, the rain begins. It falls continuously for nearly 5 years. The deluge does not clean the town, it rots it. The wooden structures built during the boom years warp and collapse. The roads turn back into impassable swamps. The modern machinery abandoned by the foreigners rusts into useless orange skeletons. The migrant workers leave, and the original families scatter. Macondo is reduced to a ghost town, populated only by a few stubborn survivors who have nowhere else to go. The final survivors of the Buendía clan retreat into their collapsing mansion. The roof has caved in on several rooms. Weeds grow through the tiles of the parlor floor. They do not attempt to rebuild, nor do they look outside the walls of the property. This total inward focus culminates in the final stage of isolation, a relationship between the last remaining man and his aunt. In a psychological sense, incest is the ultimate closed loop. It is the refusal to engage with the external world, the refusal to accept new blood or new ideas. It is the ultimate expression of narcissism, a family so consumed by its own history that it can only couple with itself, reproducing its own flaws until the code degrades completely. The consequence of this genetic loop is immediate and physical. The aunt gives birth to a male child. When they wrap the infant in a cloth, they find a cartilaginous protrusion at the base of his spine. The child is born with the tail of a pig. The delivery is violent. The mother suffers a hemorrhage and bleeds to death on the bed, her blood soaking through the mattress onto the floor. The father, overwhelmed by his partner's death, leaves the house to seek alcohol in the ruined town, leaving the newborn baby unattended on a cot. When he returns hours later, he finds the room quiet. A thick, dark line of carnivorous red ants has marched through the cracks in the wall, covered the cot, and consumed the infant, leaving only the hollowed-out skin on the sheet. The last surviving man of the clan returns to the laboratory. He sits at the table where his ancestors spent their lives working on goldfishes and useless calculations. He takes up the ancient yellowed manuscripts left behind by the traveling merchants decades ago, manuscripts written in a complex cipher that his family had tried to decode for generations. His mind is perfectly clear as he translates the text, line by line. He discovers that the papers are not a history of the past. They are a precise, chronological record of his family's existence, written 100 years before the events occurred. Every detail is recorded: the founding of Macondo, the 32 defeats of the warmonger's son, the blindness of the matriarch, the massacre in the plaza, the birth of the child with the pig's tail, and the baby's destruction by the ants. He reads the history of his own life as he is living it, realizing that his actions were never free. He was merely executing a script that had already been resolved. As he turns to the final page of the manuscript, a wind rises outside. It is not a normal rainstorm. It is a dry, violent hurricane that sweeps down from the mountains, stripping the leaves from the trees and lifting the rusted tin roofs of the empty houses. He does not try to escape. He does not look up from the page. He reads the final lines, which state that the town of Macondo will be wiped out by the wind, and that the family's history is a single closed loop that cannot be repeated, because races condemned to 100 years of solitude do not have a second opportunity on Earth. The wind shatters the windows of the laboratory, scattering the ashes of the furnace and tearing the ancient parchment from his hands. The walls of the mansion cave inward. The dust of the foundations rises into the air, blending with the storm. The wind wipes the town of Macondo and the entire Buendía bloodline off the face of the earth, erasing them from human memory. The tragedy of the Buendía clan is not that they were physically isolated in a jungle. Many communities survive in remote places. Their real affliction was solitude of a different kind, a total inability to connect with reality, an inability to love, and a complete failure to adapt. They lived in rooms full of people, yet each member remained locked inside their own head, repeating the exact same intellectual and emotional patterns until their bloodline simply ran out of energy. When we look at this cycle from a behavioral perspective, we can extract 3 practical rules for breaking our own loops. The first rule: break the generational loop. If you do not actively analyze the behavioral patterns, the coping mechanisms, and the unaddressed traumas of your parents, you will inevitably repeat them. You think you are making independent choices. You think your choice of career, your relationship dynamics, or your personal ambitions are entirely your own. But without active intervention, you are just a new actor reading from an old script. The warmonger's son ran from his father's madness, only to build his own fortress of isolation on the battlefield. To break the loop, you have to look at your family's history, not as a source of pride or shame, but as raw data. Identify the default programs. Understand what triggers them. If you do not write your own code, you will simply execute the commands that were handed down to you. The second rule: beware of the goldfishes. Action is not progress. We live in a culture that values constant movement, workaholism, and endless projects. But much of this activity is just the modern equivalent of melting down goldfishes. We build businesses we do not want, chase credentials we do not need, and create endless strategic tasks just to keep our hands moving. It is a highly effective way to numb ourselves to the quiet emptiness of a life without clear purpose. Before you invest your energy into a new project, a new conflict, or a new habit, ask yourself, are you actually moving forward? Or are you just melting down the goldfishes so you do not have to face the silence of the room? The third rule: open the system. The Buendía clan died because they operated as a closed system. They rejected the external world, ignored new ideas, and eventually coupled only with themselves. In life, business, and human relationships, a closed system is a slow death sentence. Without the constant input of harsh external feedback, the ego begins to warp. It builds a comfortable, highly logical fantasy world where you are always right, your failures are always someone else's fault, and reality is whatever you declare it to be. But the physical world does not care about your ego. The friction of reality, the customer who does not buy, the partner who leaves, the data that contradicts your theory, is not your enemy. It is the only thing that keeps you sane. You must actively seek out people and environments that challenge your assumptions. Without that friction, your system will decay from the inside out, preparing you for the arrival of your own predators. The manuscripts of the Gypsy were a record of a family that could not change. They were bound to their trajectory because they chose the comfort of their loop over the difficulty of adaptation. Races condemned to 100 years of solitude do not have a second opportunity on Earth. But your manuscript is still being written. The pen is in your hand, and the ink is still wet. Open the system. Stop melting the goldfishes. Break the loop. Thank you for listening. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for more strategic deconstructions of human behavior and systemic failure. Until next time.